Viver, não é? É muito perigoso. Porque ainda não se sabe. Porque aprender a viver é o que é o viver mesmo. That line comes from one of the greatest novels of the 20th century, by one of the greatest novelists of the 20th century, João Guimaraes, Rosa. Yet, you may have never heard of him. Which is strange, because Brazil is actually larger than the continental United States. Portuguese is the 7th most spoken language in the world, and Brazil is the 7th most populous country in the world. So maybe you've heard of Clarice Lispector, who's now having a renaissance, which is awesome. Or maybe you've heard of The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho, or maybe you didn't even realize he was Brazilian. But why haven't you heard of any other writers in the rich Brazilian history and literary tradition? In this video, I want to show you not just some Brazilian writers that you should add to your want to read list because they are incredible and amazing, but I also want to use my country's literary tradition as a case study as to why some forms of achievement become completely invisible, why some forms of achievement wade far offshore from the land of the canon, forgotten and drowned. So let's dive into some Brazilian history so you can understand why Brazil lacked momentum as compared to Europe or Hispano-America. In 1500, Pedro Álvares Cabral, a Portuguese sailor, landed on Brazil's shores. Of course, at that point, it wasn't called Brazil. It was just a region inhabited by a hugely diverse indigenous population. Between when Pedro Álvares Cabral landed and when Brazil gained its independence in 1822, 322 years passed, during which Brazil was a colonial territory, whose economy was largely structured around first the exportation of pau-brasil, Brazil wood, hence Brazil's name, then sugar, then gold. Meanwhile, in Europe, in 1572, we have Vaz de Camões, who wrote Os Lusíadas. In the 1600s, we had Cervantes, who wrote Don Quixote. In the 1700s, we had Voltaire, who wrote Candide. And meanwhile, throughout that whole time, we have Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau and Hume just prancing around having their philosophical heyday. But in 1808, a shift begins for Brazil. Napoleon was conquering Europe, and the Portuguese royal family said, we have to flee, we have to get out of here. And so they fled to Brazil. They established their headquarters in Rio de Janeiro, and thereafter, of course, institutions started improving and popping up. So we had presses and libraries. Actually, Rio has one of the most beautiful libraries in the world, in my opinion. And then, a couple of years later, in 1822, Brazil gained its independence. But of course, Brazilian identity was not necessarily a question at hand yet, because Brazil had just been born. So the questions that writers were asking could never have been, what should Brazilian literature look like? Or what is Brazilian literature? But what is Brazil? Who is Brazil? And this was further complicated by the fact that Brazil had a hugely diverse population, and still does. It's one of the most diverse countries in the world. In 1872 comes the first countrywide census, and it shows that a majority of the population in Brazil are enslaved Africans or descendants of enslaved Africans, followed by white people or mixed race people, and then followed by indigenous people. So we have this hugely diverse population at this point, and Brazil is kind of feeling like Rambo's Je est un autre, or I is someone else, because there's no sense of what is Brazilian identity, what is this collectiveness that we share, what is it to be a Brazilian? There's this internal foreignness to what Brazilian identity inherently is. Interesting enough, in 1928, Mário de Andrade wrote a novel called Macunaíma. And Macunaíma is o herói sem nenhum caráter, which by one sense means a hero with no character, such being moral character, because he is kind of a lazy, weird dude. But more profoundly, because Macunaíma, if we're painting it in broad strokes, represents Brazil, then Brazil cannot have one character. Macunaíma goes through huge transfigurations in the novel because Brazil is so richly diverse and cannot contain one singular answer. Some decades after Brazil declared its independence in the 1850s, we have writers like Álvares de Azevedo, Castro Alves, and José de Alencar, who were writing in Brazilian tradition. Perhaps it's undeniable that literature is always an act of call and response, and such that they were responding to European literary tradition. but it's kind of undeniable that they were trying to establish a Brazilian identity, like with José de Alencar's O Guarani or Iracema. Then we have Machado de Assis, who is one of the more internationally known names. Machado, in his early youth, had a brief stint with Romanticism, but he really found his footing in realism, which depicts everyday subject matter without grandiose ideas or forms. But to call Machado's Memórias Póstumas de Brás Cubas a fictional autobiography written from a man from his grave after he died, the same kind of realism as Flaubert's Madame Bovary, is to do it injustice, because Machado de Assis enacted a major reconfiguration on the aesthetics of realism. As Hans Ulrich Gumbrecht writes in his chapter on Emerging Dialogues on Machado de Assis, Machado's realism is founded on a firm philosophical questioning of placing reality into representation, and focused on a singular narrative form of instability and self-reflexivity. And it couldn't have happened any other way. In A Modernização Seletiva, uma reinterpretação do dilema brasileiro, sociologist José Souza describes the modernization during the 19th and 20th centuries as selective and superficial. He writes that while modern institutions expanded, they did so unevenly, reinforcing rather than dissolving deep social hierarchies that originated from the country's founding economic systems. Because in the 1800s and 1900s, Brazil boasted of expanding metropolises like Rio and São Paulo, but they existed alongside these quasi-feudal systems, latifúndios, large estates owned by aristocracies. And this uneven structure of modernity shapes what Brazilian literature formed into, because a striated realism cannot just exist in a singular modality of writing. Notice, in Brás Cubas, Machado is telling us a ghost story. In 1993, Jacques Derrida wrote The Spectres of Marx, in which he coined the portmanteau hauntology, arguing that the present never exists in a self-contained unit. It's always haunted by both the past and the future. So just like Brás Cubas' life is only told and only understood by way of its reflexivity after death, and Hamlet's father's ghost is a character in Hamlet enacting change, so ideology of the past informed the present. And that's what we have happening in Brazilian literature and in Brazilian history. Brazil's colonial past looms behind every act of writing, and it informs the question, who is Brazil? When the 20th century begins, we have writers like Euclides da Cunha, Monteiro Lobato, and Lima Barreto, who are all providing us different answers to the question, who is Brazil? Coexisting different answers, showing the multiplicitous identity and modality of existing of Brazilian literature, Brazilian people, and Brazilian life. So Euclides gives us the answer in the Sertão, the interiority of Brazil, which many authors focus on, like Graciliano Ramos, as well as João Guimaraes Rosa in Grande Sertão Veredas. We also have Lima Barreto, who is actually just skeptical of the entire nation-building project. We have that common saying, history is written by the victors. And Lima Barreto, who comes from a mixed-race background, is a child of slaves, says, let's look at that, let's investigate that, and throws a skeptical eye on the whole nation-building project. And then we have Monteiro Lobato, who is actually best known for writing children's literature, one of the most famous children's literature series in all of Brazil. He is kind of more focused on the how to build a nation, on the practicalities of what this nation-building project is, of what Brazilian economies can look like. He has a series of short stories called Cidades Mortas, which is all about dead cities and reliving cities and such. So the genius of Brazilian writing, it's already there. It's already established. We have a lot of great writers already, and it's only going to get better from there on. But it's never established into the canon like Dickens or like Tolstoy. And that brings us into 1922, when the Brazilian modernists come around. By 1922, European and US modernism was well underway. If you're more interested in that, I have a video about that as well, which I'll link now and in the description. And Brazilian writers who had more money, and Brazilian artists who did, went to Europe and saw this progression. They saw Cubism, Futurism, Surrealism, and they came back to Brazil with these ideas in mind. And then we have a group of 5 artists who decided that Brazil needs to establish its own tradition. That's not just a response to European literary tradition, but is something on its own. It's something that has an absolute value and has an exportable value like Pau Brasil would did in the beginning of Brazil's literary history. We'll get to that in a little bit. But these 5 artists decided that we're going to have, in the celebration of Brazil's Century of Freedom, a celebration of Brazilian history and literature as well. It was called the Semana de 22, the weekend of the 22, 22 being 1922. And it was during 3 days of Brazilian Carnaval, which is a very big festival that happens every year in Brazil on the same dates. It was an exposition in the Municipal Theater of São Paulo that was open to everybody, open to the public. It espoused around 100 works, and at night there were literary and musical listenings, readings, and gatherings. And actually, when it happened, it didn't have too much of an impact in Brazil. It was only after the death of one of the 5 main artists, Mário de Andrade, in 1945, that it was recognized as a huge catalyst and turning point in Brazilian history for Brazilian modernism and literature. Let's go back to the 20s. In 1924 and 1928, Oswaldo de Andrade wrote 2 very important manifestos for Brazilian literature at the time. The first manifesto was called the Pau Brasil Manifesto, and the idea was that Brazilian literature ought not to be defined by what it is not, aka not European literature. It should have a positive, independent definition, and this definition should come from an essential Brazilian essence. So we should go back to the primal, essential Brazilianness that we have in ourselves as Brazilians, and then use that to create exportable poetry. Just like Pau Brasil would in the beginning was very exportable and even gave the country its name, to Europe very valuable, so should Brazilian poetry and Brazilian writing and Brazilian art be equally valuable and exportable as well. The Cannibal Manifesto came 4 years later. You can already tell from the name, the vibe is different. We are talking much more aggressive, much firmer. What Oswaldo says here is that we need to devour and metabolize what it is from the other that is valuable, or in other words, Europe, and leave the rest behind, and take it and make it Brazilian. So in this metabolization within the Brazilian body, so to speak, then we birth a new Brazilian literature. And the most famous line is Tupi or not Tupi? That is the question. The idea is that Brazil ought to embrace its indigenous roots, aka Tupi, which is a broader group. There are a lot more indigenous groups and varieties in Brazil, and make Brazilian literature accessible and real for Brazilian people. Use spoken grammar. Don't use necessarily strict grammar rules. There's a famous Oswaldo poem which starts "Dê-me cigarro," which is the imperative, "give me a cigarette." And in Brazil, there's 2 different forms of formally saying that. But he says, "Deixa disso, camarada. Leave that, bro. Give me a cigarette. Me dá cigarro," as everyone says it. He's advocating for a populistic use of language and discussing things that are relevant to the Brazilian people, making Brazilian literature for the Brazilian population. Oswaldo gave a very clear answer to what and to whom he thought Brazil was. And it was a very Nietzschean, life-affirming answer. He said, say yes to all of life in its chaos and its variability and its meaninglessness. This place of rupture from which Brazilian literature must arise as a result of it being decolonial or post-colonial is, again, not a burial, but a planting. We can transfigure those by metabolizing them. That's what that Cannibal Manifesto is about. And then we can produce Brazilian literature. And that point from which on is exactly where the greatest masterpieces of Brazilian literature came. By the mid-20th century, the questions of nation, nature, essence, Brazilianness become the conditions from which Brazilian writing arises. And that's exactly the point where some of the greatest works come from. And there are a lot of writers I could introduce you to, but I'm going to pick 4 that create a more cohesive arc, even though I know I'm leaving out many, and I could make hours and hours of footage telling you about each one in more depth. So bear with me, and if you're interested in more, let me know in the comments. These 4 writers give us an arc about how Brazilian literature went from exposing materialistic conditions that is what Brazilian identity and life and reality is, to reinventing language in order to show that we need a new structure by which to convey what Brazil is. In Graciliano Ramos' works, especially Vidas Secas, we have the sertão, we have the interior. He writes a world where survival is precarious, where social structures are concrete and oppressive. And these are the ways in which we must live. There is no other choice. Here's an example of when you read Graciliano Ramos, your mouth gets dry with all the dusty sertão vocabulary, but it runs rich with images. Fabiano got along well with ignorance. Had he right to know? Had he? He hadn't. There it is. If he learned anything, he would need to learn more, and he would never be satisfied. By the way, that is my own translation that I'm using. There are different translations, but, in this video, I'm just using my own personal translations of these works. With Ramos, Brazil is hunger, Brazil is drought, Brazil is survival. Brazil is reduced to the brutal reality of material living. Fabiano knew his knowledge would make him unquenchable, which is impossible in the Caatinga where he lives. But Carlos Drummond de Andrade, from Minas and who lived in Rio, brings us from the question of how to survive and what it is to be to how is it to exist in the historical condition. I'm going to read some lines in Portuguese so you can hear the music, but I'll put the English translations below. Mãos dadas. Não serei o poeta de mundo caduco. Também não cantarei o mundo futuro. Estou preso à vida e olho meus companheiros. Estão taciturnos, mas nutrem grandes esperanças. Entre eles, considero a enorme realidade. O presente é tão grande. Não nos afastemos. Não nos afastemos muito. Vamos de mãos dadas. Drummond emphasizes the current moment, the present moment of modernity as the condition in which he has to write. He's not writing of the past. He's not writing of the future. He's writing about what it is to exist in this historical moment of modernity. He writes from the inside of intimacy, of friendships, of love, of loss, of grief, and how modernity influences and changes and shapes all of these experiences. But in Clarice Lispector, the feeling of stability begins to dissolve. Lawrence Stubbs, in his video about Clarice Lispector, puts it really well. He says that reading Lispector is kind of like reading an alien writing about human life, human activity, as observing from this alien point of view. Because the way she describes things makes these normal or everyday things seem so strange and so dissociated, because the mentality and the consciousness of the writing starts circling and circling these experiences that it can't necessarily put in words. And it flies at and fails, and it flies at and fails again and again to come to some kind of resolution. A perfect example of this is her probably oeuvre, The Passion According to G.H. The Passion According to G.H. is about a woman who finds a cockroach hidden in the closet, and she spends hours and hours and hours thinking about the implications, spiritual, transcendental, psychological, about what this experience means for her life. And she debates all of these things, including whether she should eat the cockroach or not. And that's what happens over 300 pages. And much like Setha trying to, in Beloved, tell Paul D about her difficult experiences, there's that wonderful scene where she's just circling and circling, and she can't ever approximate it or articulate it. Clarice Lispector shows there's this irreducibility, there's this instability that never allows us to fully grasp what it is to be this consciousness in modernity. And while Clarice Lispector is focused on the failure of language, Guimaraes Rosa then comes and he goes, what if we just reinvented it? What if we just changed it? If there are experiences that languages cannot contain, Guimaraes Rosa says, let's change language. That's exactly what he does in his pièce de résistance, Grande Sertão Veredas. In Grande Sertão, he creates a hybrid language that uses erudite Portuguese, rural Portuguese from the sertão, the interior, as well as mythologies and neologisms, which critics liken often to James Joyce in Ulysses. The novel Grande Sertão is a stream of consciousness novel that goes back and forth in time and tells a story and then rethinks the story and is complex and beautiful like Ulysses. In 2016, Words Without Borders, an excellent literary journal about translation, publish an excerpt of a translation of Grande Sertão. I'll also link it in the description so you can check it out if you're interested. But from the beginning, João Guimarães Rosa lets us know that the world we're entering is a world of rupture, is a new world, is something we've never experienced before. Because the first line and the first word, it's just one word, is no nada. In English, the translator from Words Without Borders translated it to no not. But no nada can mean a lot of things. It's not a word in Portuguese, dictionary word. It can mean in the middle of nowhere, from nowhere, it's nothing, don't worry about it. But in all of these, we come from a point of zero. We have nothing. We are in nothing. And from that point of creation, we can start renewing or giving a new sense to things. And that's what Guimarães Rosa does in Grande Sertão. And then we have to ask, why isn't this literature considered among the greats? What happened? Where did it get lost? A simple answer, which is, I believe, overly simplistic, is that Grande Sertão, for example, because precisely of its linguistic, uniqueness and amazingness and innovation, is untranslatable. Yet, we hear from a lot of people that Dostoevsky, for example, is untranslatable, that in the first lines of Notes from the Underground, he uses I in many different ways in Russian, which in Russian links form and content and gives us a totally different understanding of what the text already presents to us. And yet, maybe you've read Notes from the Underground, you've probably heard of it, and there are many translations in English that you could pick up. So I would venture to say translation is not the issue. The issue is that what is understood as canon is not an objectively formed list. It's a historically informed and, frankly, colonial endeavor that has informed how we understand literature and where Brazilian literature has been categorized. In Arthur Crystal's essay collection, This Thing We Call Literature, he gives a brief history of the canon. The word canon, from the Greek, originally meant measuring stick or rule, and was used by the Church Fathers to differentiate the genuine or canonical books of the Bible from the apocryphal ones. In effect, the canon formalized modern literature as a select body of imaginative writings that could stand up to the Greek and Latin texts. That is, the Iliad and the Odyssey, which became benchmarks for quality writing. But when European nations started focusing on their own languages and their own literary traditions, Europe and England, for example, was like, well, we need Shakespeare, we need Milton, and France was like, well, we need Montaigne and Molière. And that's how the canon started forming as we know it today. Russian literature, like Dostoevsky or Tolstoy, was already in a European-facing literary tradition. Russian to French translation or Russian to German was already more readily available. It became absorbed into European intellectual history. Crystal continues on. The canon anointed the worthy, and by implication the unworthy, functioning as a set of commandments that saved people the trouble of deciding what to read. And these became the classics. Then in the 1970s and the 1960s, informed by the cultural context of the Cold War and the Cuban Revolution, a lot more international attention started focusing itself upon the region of Latin America, let's say. But mind you, Grande Sertão Veredas had already been written. It was written in 1956, or published then. And Brazilian literature was again left out of this moment because a lot of the focus was on Hispanic literature or Spanish written literature. And moreover, Spain became a strong proponent of publishing Spanish literature and pushed a lot of the Latin American literature like that by Gabriel Garcia Marquez or Mario Vargas Llosa or Carlos Fuentes or Jorge Luis Borges into Spanish-speaking and English-speaking and other language-speaking context outside of Latin America. But Brazil was still left out and forgotten. The issue is that Brazilian literature has been relegated to subgenre. It's Latin American literature. It's regional modernism. It's something else entirely. And of course, the thing is, I keep referring to this canon as this kind of list, but it's not a physical list. Just as a two-dimensional printed map of the world that you have seen all your life, you know is distorted in size. Places are not as big or as small as they're actually depicted. So the map of world literature that many of us have inherited is similarly distorted. In English, the word fate comes from the Latin fatum, as in a thing said and then written down, because when it's written down, it's there forever. Luckily, we now have translations of Clarice Lispector, of Guimaraes Rosa, of Carlos Drummond de Andrade, Graciliano Ramos, etc., etc. And you, as a reader, can consume this literature with the awareness you've now learned, and you can change what is read, how it is read, and by whom it is read. And you can be a guerrilla reader, perhaps. Every literary canon is a history of attention as well. It shows us what generations of readers have chosen to preserve, as well as what they were taught to overlook. Brazil's history and Brazil's hidden canon shows us that visibility and greatness are not the same thing, nor are invisibility and greatness mutually exclusive. It shows us that literary masterpieces might be lying just beyond the map of what we already know, just beyond its visibility. And while the map that we've inherited is incomplete, that every act of reading can be a redrawing. And obviously, as a Brazilian, I want more Brazilian literature in the canon, but I know that there are many, many overlooked literary traditions. So I'm curious as to what you would say is a literary tradition that has been overlooked, or writers from your country or your background that have been overlooked and ought to be included into our must-read lists. If you've made it this far, thank you again. I appreciate your time and attention as always. Obrigados brasileiros. Please let me know if there's anything else you'd like to hear from me, any thoughts you have on Brazilian literature, on the tyranny of the canon, or anything else. Thank you. And read on.